In this episode of the Hill Country Podcast, I visit with Dr. Kathleen Hudson, professor at Schreiner University. However, we're not talking about her work at Schreiner. We're going to talk about the Jimmie Rodgers Tribute that she is chairing on September 10, 2022 at Café on the Ridge.
The Texas Hill Country is one of the most beautiful places on earth. In this podcast, recent Hill Country resident Tom Fox visits with the people and organizations that make this one of the most unique areas of Texas. Join Tom as he explores the people, places, and their activities of the Texas Hill Country.
Find out more about this great musical event in this episode. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode, and today I'm thrilled to have back with me Kathleen Hudson, professor at Schreiner University. We are not here to talk about her work at Schreiner today, although I'm sure we will touch on that. We're here to talk about a true passion project Kathleen has, and that is around Jimmie Rodgers. So, Kathleen, first of all, welcome back.
Thank you. I'm excited to be back.
Could you tell our audience who was Jimmie Rodgers?
Most people know Jimmie Rodgers as the father of country music. A lot of people do not know that he's been inducted into every Hall of Fame, and he recorded with Louis Armstrong. He pivotal in the history of country music, and Ken Burns made that very clear in his recent country music program. Jimmie Rodgers was a moment in time. There was hillbilly music. The sounds of black field hollers. Somehow he wove all of those sounds together, and looking back, he was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame and declared the father of country music. Of course, nobody knows they're doing that at the moment they're doing it. He was busy working on the railroad. He had always been interested in vaudeville. I think at age 13, he actually ran out and organized a traveling show, and he was on the radio performing. But when he was diagnosed with a death sentence, tuberculosis at that time, he had to leave the railroad, even though he's also known as America's singing brakeman. But he left the railroad and went completely into music. And he ended up in Kerrville. In 1929, he built a beautiful house, his dream house, Blue Yodeler's Paradise, at 617 West Main. And he spent 2 years here, 1929 to 1931. There's a wonderful book on Jimmie Rodgers by Nolan Porterfield. I actually brought Nolan to Schreiner at one time, and because I do teach here, you mentioned this being a passion. My passions end up living on this campus in my classroom. And so for many years, I did a tribute to Jimmie Rodgers here at Schreiner. And some years I'd have a panel of scholars. One year I had the Texas Folklore Society come and give presentations. A couple of years ago, I brought one of the great-grandsons here, family. I used to work with Jimmie Rodgers' grandson, Jimmie Dale Court, and 1996 was the last year he played for the event that I produce every September. And in 1996, we were down in Louise Hayes Park, and I actually have a recording from that year. We have 5 archival copies, and we'll have them at our event this year. And in that recording, we have 4 or 5 songs by Jimmie Dale Court, the grandson of Jimmie Rodgers. And his children are not performing, and they're not musicians right now, but one of them, Austin, looks a lot like Jimmie Rodgers. He carries that look. So I have a lot of stories about this passion, and it began for me when I moved to Kerrville in 1984 at the request of Rod Kennedy to help him with his songwriting foundation. And I had a new PhD with a focus on writing And I had interviewed people at the Kerrville Folk Festival. I come to town in 1984 in August. All of a sudden, we go down to the depot, which is now Rails. Rod Kennedy was producing the tribute to Jimmie Rodgers. It had been produced by the Kerrville Historical Society, and it was brought to this town by Mike Walker, may he rest in peace, and his wife then, Cat Walker. So they desire to pay tribute to Jimmie. Now, the question is, how did I pick up that banner? I hadn't heard of Jimmie. I hadn't heard the music. I was not particularly a fan. But in that moment at the depot, when I saw Jimmie Rodgers' grandson performing, and I felt the energy of the crowd, and there were a lot of older people there, and there were people in Kerrville who remembered their father might have had a talk with Jimmie Rodgers. And there was just this wonderful community spirit that caught me. And so the next year, Rod Kennedy said, too much trouble, no money, I'm not going to do that event anymore. And at that time, Bill Lang with Budweiser said, I've got $1,500 sponsorship if somebody wants to do it. So I raised my hand as a volunteer, and that's how I started doing it. So my passion now, after all these years, because I've done it every year in some form since 1985, my passion now is to share not just the history and the heritage, but to actually share the life of someone who could be an example for all of us. He did not quit when he was diagnosed with tuberculosis, and he could have. He came to Kerrville. Kerrville had a sanitarium here. Kerrville took care of people with TB. Now, the stories about him in Kerrville, driving his big car, having his flask of whiskey in the door, driving too fast around town. In the early 80s, I gathered a few of the stories about Jimmie Rodgers in Kerrville. So that's the short story of the father of country music in Kerrville, Texas.
So why don't you tell us about this year's festival and performance, and when it's going to be, where it's going to be, and what you hope to achieve?
Great. This year, we're going to go back into the community, and Café at the Ridge has a new amphitheater, Ridge Rock Amphitheater, and it's behind that beautiful garden. And they've had several events out there already. You bring your own lawn chair. We'll have a food truck. We're bringing in a young man, Miles Garcia, who has a food truck called Munchies. We will have music on Saturday, September 10th from 7 to 9. The first hour, we're using it as an open mic for people to come tell stories, share songs. I already have 7 or 8 people who are lined up, but if you're one of the listeners and you want to come sing a song, just show up a little early and let me know. And then after about an hour, we're going to showcase a songwriter new to this community, Bernie Nelson. And Bernie probably has sales on 30 million hits on his songs. He has a book of interviews with songwriters that he knew and worked with in Nashville. I've asked him to bring copies of his book to the event. And this year, the theme is on the songwriting. So Jimmie Rodgers is in the Songwriters Hall of Fame. Bernie Nelson is an acclaimed songwriter. He even has a special cabin or room here at his place in Fredericksburg where a songwriter can come have a retreat with him and learn how to write songs. So our theme, which is near and dear to my heart, of course, is writing. So our theme is the songwriting, and we're honoring Bernie Nelson. So this year, there's no charge. We would love to see the community gather and remember our heritage. Saturday, September 10th from 7 to 9 at the Ridge Rock Amphitheater.
So let's talk about a little bit more about Jimmie Rodgers, because you said something that I wanted to pick up on. You said that he was able to synthesize a lot of the different sounds and music in the teens and 20s. And obviously, hillbilly. We also had cowboys. You talked about black farm workers. You even threw a little jazz with Louis Armstrong. And it seems to me the truly tectonic shifts in music are when one person seems to be able to put together these kinds of disparate sounds. And I'm going to point to Elvis Presley putting black music with rock and roll at the time. But this synthesis, and if I could contrast that with maybe the people like the Carter family, who they took the music they were hearing in the hills and were able to bring it, but it really wasn't a synthesis of a lot of different styles. Could you talk about that a little bit?
You've said it so well. Maybe I might want to bring in the metaphor of weaving and bringing these different sounds and weaving them together into a new tapestry, which I think if we looked closely, one of the writers that I follow is Bob Dylan. And not only is he the Nobel laureate of literature, but he has had his own moments of synthesis. So I think you're right. That's pivotal, pulling that together. Now, Jimmie Rodgers added this yodel, and it's not a Swiss yodel. It's not 5 octaves at a time. It's 1 octave, goes up and comes down, up and down, and that's it. And supposedly, scholars in this field, especially Nolan Porterfield, feel like that he was replicating some of they were called field hollers, but the sounds just going across the fields. So that'd be an interesting exploration to look at the synthesis in certain songs.
We are extraordinarily fortunate to have a catalog of recorded material from Jimmie Rodgers.
Yes.
Can you tell us how those recordings came about and why?
I wish I could tell you more about that moment that Ralph Peer came, and at that time, labels went out into the field to find performers. Changed into labels sitting high on the hill and the performer knocking on the door with their song saying, please record me. But at this time, this particular session, which I'm thinking might have been 1927, but I don't have it off the top of my head, very famous recording session. Jimmie Rodgers actually went to that session with his band, and Ralph Peer said, come back without the band. So there's some interesting stories about that. But he lived in Kerrville until 1931, moved to a duplex in San Antonio, and his last moment was to go to New York and record more songs. Excuse me. And according to his daughter, Anita, whom I met and interviewed in San Antonio, her daddy was doing that so his wife and little girl would be financially secure. So that's interesting. He's going to go, he's dying of tuberculosis, and he died in a final recording session in New York, 1933. He's recording, but he's not just recording because he has all these songs he has to get out of him. He's actually thinking, his wife and my little girl, Anita, I need to take care of them. He was only 35 years old.
Right. What do you know of his time? What have you been able to find out about his time in Kerrville?
I talked to Florence Sanchez, who had a uncle who played music in the Sanchez Barber Shop, and one of the stories I heard was that Jimmie Rodgers asked the owner of that barbershop, who was a Sanchez, gave him a nickel and told him to go get a Coke for him. And just little anecdotes like that. Of course, the big story is that he drove the big car, he was drinking too much whiskey, and he practiced up in the top of Pampel's, which is now the Hungry Fork. He practiced up there, and he performed at the Arcadia. So that's interesting. But Blue Yodeler's Paradise is forever frozen in time in one of his recordings, and you hear a knock at the door, and Jimmie's wife, "Why, Jimmie, it's the Carter family." So a lot of people think, wow, the Carter family went to Kerrville. I don't think that's what happened. But the recording did point to Kerrville. And they said, "Why, Jimmie, you can see all the way to Mexico." Now, every time I drive by 617 West Main, or maybe I go on Jackson Road on the side of it, I look around and I'm not seeing all the way to Mexico. But at the time he built it, I think I've heard that it was about $55,000. That was in 1929. Wow. 1929.
Yeah, that's a lot of money.
Yeah.
You mentioned Ken Burns' documentary on country music. Just a fabulous project by Ken Burns. And he did it. Jimmie Rodgers has been identified as the father of country music. Is there a way for us to not simply place him in that pantheon, but have him, is there a way you can describe how he speaks to you today, or how you might hope that someone attending the show on September 10th, that Jimmie Rodgers, through his songwriting, might speak to them?
That is a great question. Wow. I'm just trying to put myself in that place of listening to those songs, and I'm just so drawn to the passion that he had and all the stories I've heard. There was a fellow named Henry Young who used to come to our event here in Kerrville, and Henry said that you could go down the street in Lubbock, Texas, and start at one end and hear Jimmie Rodgers coming out of every house until you got down to the other end. And he told me, he had a radio show and he did a lot of research on Jimmie Rodgers, Henry Young, and he told me that the diagnosis of tuberculosis and the fact that he kept going and kept performing was central to his message, no matter what he was singing. Now, the other thing, he didn't even write all those songs. His wife's sister, and I met his wife's sister's daughter, and I brought her here in 1996. But his wife's sister wrote a lot of those songs, and at that time it wasn't proper or appropriate for a woman to be saying those things. "I'll be your sidetrack, honey, till your main man comes," or something. So sometimes her name is on the song, and a lot of times. So back to your original question, when you're hearing the song, you're not necessarily just hearing what Jimmie had in his heart to say. There's all those other threads, and the more research I do, to me, the more interesting the music gets. Now, Leonard Skinner took T for Texas into a whole new realm, and the interpretations of his songs. Bob Dylan had an album, a tribute to Jimmie Rodgers. He put it on his own label, Egyptian, his own money, and he got a group of people to all sing Jimmie. And I really have wanted to talk to Bob Dylan about why he did that. The next year, he explored the Carter family. Whatever you know about Bob, he really appreciated and honored traditional music. But on this album, Dylan sang My Blue-Eyed Jane. Willie Nelson sings Peach Pickin' Time in Georgia. Steve Earle sings In the Jailhouse Now. Jerry Garcia of the Grateful Dead, this was the last song he recorded before he died, Blue Yodel Number 9. It's an interesting collection, and this is one way that someone paid tribute to Jimmie. And the way we do it in Kerrville, Texas, is to gather somewhere in September. His birthday, September 8th. He was born September 8th, 1897, and he died in May 1930.
So we're going to get together on Saturday, September 10th at Café on the Ridge and hopefully listen to some up-and-coming musicians and listen to Bernie Nelson sing. And I hope if you're in town listening to this, you'll come out and join us and maybe get a little flavor of what the grandfather of country western music started for all of it.
And he was labeled the father
Right.
of country music. I think it was when the Country Music Hall of Fame was built. And so that was way after the fact, like possibly 1964. In one of my songbooks, it says that's when he got that label.
So anything else you'd like to add, Kathleen?
I'm just sometimes ask myself, what am I doing every September? And I realize that it connects me to so many musicians that I appreciate. And it's become, for me, something that I'm determined to do in Kerrville, Texas, every September until I no longer do it.
I don't think I'm ever going to look at a weaved rug the same way again. Thanks a lot, and I'm looking forward to continuing our conversations, Kathleen.
Thank you very much.